of the Orange County Sisters in Crime chapter. I'd like to welcome you all to our monthly meeting and introduce you to our wonderful speaker. We are so lucky to have him with us today. He has spoken to at our chapter a number of times. So you have a lot of fans in this group, Todd.
No pressure. I hope I don't say anything that completely rebuffs everything I've said in the past.
Yeah, and I am a little disappointed that we didn't record everything that we talked about before. But anyway, those people just have to come earlier next month. All right, so Todd, I'm going to introduce Todd. Todd is the New York Times bestselling author of over a dozen books, including The Low Desert, Gangsterland, which was a finalist for the Hammock Prize, Gangster Nation, The House of Secrets, which he co-authored with Brad Meltzer, Living Dead Girl, a finalist for the LA Times Book Prize, and the popular Burn Notice series. Ooh. What was Michael's last name? Michael
Weston.
Weston. Oh, I don't know how I forgot that. His books have been published in a dozen languages and around the world, and were twice named a finalist for the VN International Thriller of the Year Award. His short fiction has been collected in 3 volumes: Simplify, which won the Other Voices Book Prize and was a finalist for the SCBA Award, Other Resort Cities, and his latest book, The Low Desert Gangster Stories, and has been widely anthologized. His essays, journalism, and criticism have appeared in numerous publications, including the LA Times, USA Today, and the Wall Street Journal, among other publications and anthologies, and have earned 5 Nevada Press Association awards for excellence, while his essay, When They Let Them Bleed, wow, that's intense, was selected for Best American Essays. For his body of work, Todd was honored with the Silver Pen Award from the Nevada Writers Hall of Fame. In addition to his work on the page, Todd is also the co-host of the podcast Literary Disco, which I highly recommend if anybody enjoys a good literary podcast, along with Julia Pistel and Writer Strong, which has been named a top podcast by the Washington Post, The Guardian, Mashable, and even Good Housekeeping. Wow.
I got the Good Housekeeping seal of approval.
Yeah.
Finally.
He is also co-host, along with essayist Maggie Downs, of Open Book on KCOD Coachella FM, the leading public radio station in the Coachella Valley. Todd holds an MFA in creative writing and literature from Bennington College and is a professor of creative writing at the University of California, Riverside, where he directs the low residency MFA program in creative writing and writing for the performing arts. He lives in Indio, California with his wife, the beauty writer Wendy Duran. So welcome, Todd.
Hey, everybody.
Yeah.
I sound very impressive when you read about me like that. My gosh.
I know. Well, we're excited to hear about the writing franchise characters. I think that's what you're going to talk about today.
Yeah, I thought we would do that, and of course, I'm happy to talk about anything else afterwards. The talk I'm going to do will take about 45 minutes or so, but feel free to interrupt me whenever you want, ask questions. As a professor, I am used to being interrupted ad nauseum with great questions from smart people. I expect nothing less from all of you. And then I'm happy to talk about anything else too. If you have questions at the end about anything related to anything, I am prepared to speak extemporaneously for up to 30 seconds about any topic, even if I don't know anything about it. I'm ready.
Okay, right. I think that's fair enough. Okay, whenever you're ready, let's start.
All right, let's get started then. So I'm gonna share the screen. So let me do that and pull up something that we're going to look at periodically. Hold on one sec. There we go. Make sure it's the right one. There we go. Okay. So if you have questions along the way, feel free just to unmic yourself and ask, or if you want to put them in the chat. It's a little hard to see the chat when I'm sharing the screen, so it's almost better if you just interrupt me. But I'll go and I'll look at the chat a little bit as we go along too.
And Todd, if you want, I can keep an eye on the chat for you also.
Okay.
Okay.
And I'll stop intermittently and ask you guys if you have questions also. So I wanted to talk today about writing continuing characters and writing franchise characters, because I find that it's a thing that even for those of you that are professional writers, can be a sort of a confounding notion, because there's that idea, right, as crime writers, that we're supposed to create a franchise, that we're supposed to find characters that we can use over and over and over again, because invariably an agent or an editor is going to say, well, could this be a sequel? Could this be a trilogy? Could this be a TV show? How can you use this character again? Because I think we're conditioned as readers, and really as crime writers, to think of a really good character as a durable device that we can use over and over and over again. In my own career, I've found that to be especially true. So I've written about 15 books, and in that time, I've written 5 books using Michael Weston from Burn Notice. I've written 3 books with the Rabbi David Cohen, Sal Cupertine character, which is Gangsterland, Gangster Nation, and then he also appears in The Low Desert, Gangster Stories. And then in The Low Desert, in this collection, there's actually 6 different stories that have the same character in them. And then throughout the 12 stories in this book, characters drop in and out of from different parts of their lives into different stories. So the stories in this book are connected, but they're not connected in like an Olive Kittredge kind of way, if that is a book you're familiar with. But then there's also a character named Morris Drew, who is the main character of the title story of The Low Desert, who also appeared in my novel Living Dead Girl, which came out 20 years ago, as the sheriff of a small town. And I've been writing about this character, Morris Drew, at different stages of his life over different stages of my own career, with the idea that eventually I would write a book about this character or write a TV show about this character. He's always had this real appeal in my mind, but I've had this champagne problem over the years of having sold other books that I don't get to write about him in. I mean, it's like, what a horrible first world writer problem. I don't have time to write about this character. I'm too busy writing about other characters people are paying me to write about. So then there's that character. And then there's The House of Secrets, the book that I wrote with Brad Meltzer, which we had also intended to be a series, but both of us are too busy to write the second book together, which is, again, sort of a champagne problem. But we wrote this book with the notion that we could pick it up at any point when we both had time and write another book about this character, for as long as we both wanted to do it. So essentially, I've built my career around using characters over and over and over again. And so I've sort of come up with a notion of how to create character that is durable enough to use it time and again. But there's also this idea that a continuing character doesn't even need to be one that you created yourself. There's the notion that a continuing character is born from the starting of a genre, right? From the canon of literature itself. So we think about that when we think about vampire novels often, right? Like there is the notion of Bram Stoker's Dracula, right? There's that Dracula. Or there's Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, or Frankenstein's monster, so that we're literally correct. And then when we think about the detective specifically, what that really comes from, the idea of this character really comes from this example that we have here from The Maltese Falcon, from Sam Spade. Now, Dashiell Hammett only wrote about Sam Spade in one novel, in The Maltese Falcon. And of course, that was made into several movies over the years. And Hammett also used him in some short stories. And then there was a radio show about him. And just the name Sam Spade is the detective, right? Like if you say, all right, Sam Spade, that means detective. We know that now as a detective name. But so the ethos of this character, the notion of this private eye and what that private eye stands for, and this can be also, sort of a rogue cop type character, derives exactly from this quote here that we have on the page. So I'm going to read this aloud. This is from the Maltese Falcon. It's towards the end of the Maltese Falcon. And Sam Spade says to the woman who has hired him, whose name I cannot remember all of a sudden. One of you will remember it and you'll scream it out loud. He says, "I'm a detective, and expecting me to run criminals down and then let them go free is like asking a dog to catch a rabbit and let it go. It can be done all right, and sometimes it is done, but it's not the natural thing." And from that paragraph, an entire genre of crime fiction is born. The dimensions of that character, the notions of what it means to be the private eye, the notion of what it means to be this sort of rogue guy who goes out there and maybe he'll let someone get away with a crime, but he's not going to let everyone get away with a crime. He's not going to let someone do something really bad and then just go because it's against his nature. That comes from this area. And everything I've written about in my life essentially comes from these sentences. And everything my brother has written comes from these sentences. Every cop show you see comes from these sentences. You know, every private eye, even if you've never book that you've written or read, even if you've never read this, comes from this because you've been influenced by someone who's influenced by that. And so that all of a sudden we have this durable, returnable character that Dashiell Hammett has created for us, and he didn't even bother to go back and use them again. So think about that as sort of your opening notion of what a continuing character can be and what a franchise can look like. It's a little bit different between genre fiction, though, and literary fiction. So I'm presuming some of you go back and forth and do a little bit of literary fiction writing as well. In literary fiction, you want to create a character with either a lasting emotional conflict or with a tangible physical one. So in genre fiction, you're going to create a character with a job that doesn't get the character killed most of the time, and do that in a plausible way. But in all cases, you want to give the characters enough complexity that readers want to spend more time with them. So if you're writing about a cop, you know, he or she may get shot, but they're not going to die because not everyone dies when they get shot. Or they're going to be so great that they get beaten up and it doesn't really have an effect on them. Literary fiction is a little bit different in this regard. You know, you want that lasting emotional conflict. So let's take a look at a really good example of that. Have any of you read the book, The Sports Writer by Richard Ford? I'm just looking at the gallery here. Or heard of Richard Ford. So Richard Ford is sort of a cherished American novelist and short story writer. When he wrote the book, The Sports Writer, in the mid-1980s, he was not the cherished American writer that he is now. He had had a couple of novels and they hadn't done particularly well. He'd had a collection of short stories that had done somewhat well. But he was looking for a character that he could write about, much the way that, you know, Updike had written about Rabbit, right? And so the character that he decided to write was a character named Frank Bascom. And this is the opening of the first book that he wrote of him, called The Sports Writer. "My name is Frank Bascom. I am a sports writer. For the past 14 years, I have lived here at 19 Hoving Road in a large Tudor house bought when a book of short stories I wrote sold to a movie producer for a lot of money and seemed to set my wife and me and our 3 children, 2 of whom were not even born yet, up for a good life." All right, someone tell me what the most important word in that paragraph is. Turn on your mic and scream it.
Seemed.
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 Yes.
There is a lifetime in the word seemed, right? Oh my God. As soon as the word seemed shows up, we know he didn't have a good life. We know that everything went to shit. What we don't know, and what Richard Ford probably did not know in 1983 when he started to write this book, is that seemed would encompass the next 4 decades of Ford's writing life. 3 novels, four novels, a short story collection, another novel that's coming out. You know, the National Book Award, the Pulitzer Prize, he's won every single thing for these books. And it comes from that word seemed. So there are far fewer franchise characters in literary fiction, however, because in literary fiction, we tend to think about characters from the belly button in, right? Like it's more of an internal struggle that they're having than an external one. Whereas in crime fiction, it's more of a plot-driven problem. So therefore, someone can have internal issues. They can be depressed, they can be an alcoholic, their spouse can left them, they can have seemed to have had a good life. But none of that is as important as finding the dead girl or the money or whatever. And so you need to, when you're doing this for genre fiction, have both that durable plot that you can use, the job that doesn't get them killed, but also if you really want to be successful, you have to give them the emotional complexity of seemed. And this, I mean, what a great, you know, notion that all you need, right, to create an amazing franchise character is in an opening paragraph, the word seemed. It does everything for you. But there's a similarity between the seemed and that note from Dashiell Hammett. Now, the seemed here, this is the opening of The Sports Writer. This line from the Maltese Falcon comes about 250 pages in, but both of them are about expectations that you're creating for the character, right? They're about setting the reader up for what they can reasonably assume is going to happen and then flipping it upside down. That's what you have to constantly do with these sort of franchise characters, or else the reader gets, the book gets predictable and the reader gets bored with it pretty easily. I had a conversation one time with one of my heroes, with Donald Westlake, who meant more to me than my own father did, and I knew him better also. And I had done an event with Donald Westlake, and afterwards I got just to sit and bullshit with him, which was, you know, it was like the greatest moment of my entire life. And this was some years ago. This was probably 15 years ago at this point. And I said to him, because at the time I was really having a problem in my writing with endings. And Westlake had always seemed like a guy who really knew how to end a short story or end a novel. And I asked him, how do you know when your story is over? Like, how do you stay unpredictable to the reader? And he said, I know my book is over. I know a story is over. I know a chapter is over when the reader could write the next page. And I was like, oh, like that's sort of a strikingly simple thing, right? But when you think about it on a craft level, page by page by page, it forces you, and of course, you know, Westlake wrote like 5 different continuing characters over the course of his career under different pen names. It forces you to make sure that your character makes decisions that are both logical but also impulsive. And that will keep the reader sort of off guard, even when they know that character particularly well. Okay. Any questions before I move on to the next thing? No? Okay.
I think we're good.
All right. So the second thing you want to do is you want to create indelible but also interchangeable secondary characters. And the reason for this is very simple, which is that you want to show the main character book by book in a new light by providing new mirrors that reflect him or her. And as the secondary characters change book to book, so too does the main character, because that character becomes a different person to the different characters in the book. Now you see this a lot, particularly in sort of genre fantasy, where it's a continuing character. Think about books like The Hunger Games, for instance, where every book in the series of The Hunger Games, Katniss dives into that world and she's got 10 new people that she's fighting against to win the Hunger Games. And Suzanne Collins does this very well. These people are archetypes, but they reveal something in Katniss each time that is a little bit different. I think the other person that does this extraordinarily well is James Lee Burke. Every new Robichaux novel, James Lee Burke has his buddy is it Cletus? Not Cletus. What's his name?
That's it.
Cletus?
Yeah, that's it.
And they go out there and he's out there in his pork pie hat and they're solving crimes. But then you meet someone else new in New Iberia that maybe Dave has known for 25 years, but we've never met. And each book, all of a sudden, you have someone else that reflects Dave back to us. Dave at whatever age he is, Dave with whatever problem that he has. And he also uses, I think very effectively, his own characters' family members as they age and before they die, where Alifair as a child is different than Alifair when she's an adult, and Bootsy as his wife is different in book 1 than she is in book 9. So you are able to enhance the character by being realistic with the other people in their lives. And I think that really gives something to the reader. It gets boring when the secondary characters stay the same. So think about like Hawk in the Spencer novels for the first, 35 of them. Like how many times can Hawk say something badass and Spencer can laugh and then the chapter ends and someone says, well, fucking onion, we're going to drive down the street. You're like, wow, it's a weird thing to say, Hawk, but okay. It can get a little trite. So you want to try to you want to try to change up as much as possible. Also, this is true because the cases in crime fiction invariably highlight some other portion of the main character's life. So for me, for instance, in writing the Hitman books, Gangsterland and Gangster Nation, and then also the new book, The Low Desert, of which there are now 13 signed copies available in W Store because Maddie bought one. Is that I want players both on the page and off the page, people in your memory, to move into the narrator's life, but have a continuing effect. So this is another important part of this is narrative memory. And I think the best books that use a continuing character have narrative memory, where someone is still healing from the things that happened in the book before. It's not like someone is in a book and 25 people get murdered and the next book starts and that person's perfectly normal. Like that's absurd. That's nuts. Does no one in detective fiction have PTSD? I mean, also, how many cozies where someone's a caterer and a dead body shows up? Like, wouldn't that person just get out of the catering business at some point? Like, my God, I don't want to eat a bunch of appetizers with dead bodies wherever this person's doing events. It's just a small problem that I have. Okay, but that leads me to point number 3, which is maintaining a reasonable level of consistency. So if your character has a peculiar personality trait, it doesn't mean you need to hit the same notes book after book. But if he or she hates cheese in book 1, make sure that you don't open book 2 with a character eating a grilled cheese sandwich, But so here's where I think we get into trouble. Like it's the Game of Thrones trouble, where you're so successful that you can't remember the things that you set forth with your character 20,000 pages ago. Like, I don't know about you guys, but I wrote Gangsterland. The book came out in 2014, so that means I wrote it and I finished writing it in 2010. 2013. The book is 450 pages long. I have no idea what happened in it. I have no idea. I have a general sense of the premise. I know how it ends, but I just can't remember all the facts about it. And I don't want to go back and read it. I could maybe listen to the audiobook. And so I really do keep like a list of sort of important facts about my characters, like how many kids did that guy have? How did that guy die? Because I don't remember what I had for breakfast this morning. How the hell am I going to remember what I wrote in 2012 about a fake person in a book? So 20 years ago, that didn't matter, this notion of consistency, because people weren't on the internet telling you every day how much you suck. But now, if you get something wrong in your own book, you are gonna hear it. Someone is going to contact you. There's going to be a thread on Twitter about this. So keep that in mind, a level of consistency. Questions, are we good? Anything that's unclear? Okay. I want to take a look at another device that we use as writers, which is creating personal and professional cliffhangers that we're not afraid to leave unanswered. But that also means setting up a character immediately and forcing the reader not to have questions about it. So the best example of this is actually in, don't let this make you nauseous as I scroll, is actually in Interview with a Vampire by Anne Rice. And I'll read this a little bit here and we'll discuss why it's important. So this is the opening of Interview with a Vampire. "I see," said the vampire thoughtfully, and slowly he walked across the room toward the window. For a long time, he stood there against the dim light from Divisadero Street and the passing beams of traffic. The boy could see the furnishings of the room more clearly now, the round oak table, the chairs, a wash basin hung on one wall with a mirror. He set his briefcase on the table and waited. "But how much tape do you have with you?" asked the vampire, turning now so the boy could see his profile. "Enough for the story of a life." Okay. What has Anne Rice done in this opening paragraph that allows her to have written 25, 30 books about vampires subsequently? What has she done? Someone just scream it out.
Story for a life.
Story for life is one point. Yes, absolutely. But there's one other thing.
The unbelievability of that there is a vampire.
Absolutely. Barbara wins. Barbara gets a free book from Debbie. No.
You get a car, Barbara. Yeah.
I get a car.
Barbara gets a free car.
You know, out of all the things that you're talking, I read it and I've seen this movie a million times. So, and I
Good.
love this movie.
And it's little Kirsten Dunst is the baby vampire in that.
Yeah. The whole thing was wonderful.
So yes, Barbara is absolutely correct, and Maddie is correct too. It is the words "said the vampire" as the opening sentence. All of a sudden, we have a cliffhanger. We have a conflict. We have a world that has been created in 3 words. Said the vampire. Actually, 4 words. Said the vampire thoughtfully. Because it's not just that vampires exist, it's that vampires exist and are thoughtful. And that the vampire can exist and will not eat you immediately upon meeting you. So all of a sudden, there's vampires. Okay, we accept that. There's vampires. There's thoughtful vampires. Okay. Oh, there's a vampire that wants to tell you a story. Oh, that's unusual. Oh, there's a vampire who's thoughtful, wants to tell you a story, and is not going to fucking eat you. Drink.
Not yet.
Immediately upon you sitting down to talk to them. What is this world that we've been delivered? We've never seen this before. And it requires no further examination for you to dive into the book. You are there. So by creating this right now on page 1, immediately the reader comes in with a boatload of questions, and you always want to keep having the reader have questions with a continuing character, the franchise character, or with the one-time character. You always want to keep them asking questions, because what did Donald Westlake teach us? As soon as the reader can write the next page, you're cooked. You can't write the next page of this. You have no idea what's going to happen next. And so when we talk about cliffhangers, I don't mean it in the sort of established sense of it. I mean it in sort of a larger existential sense of it, is that always be leaving unanswered questions for the reader. I mean this scene to scene, I mean this chapter to chapter, I mean this book to book. You can't be scared when you're writing a series to leave something big unanswered at the end of it. Now, for me, I left something really big unanswered at the end of my book, Gangster Nation, and then I wrote a collection of short stories, The Low Desert, instead of the next novel. And I recognize some people are angry about that, but you know, the muse, what are you going to do? Okay, which leads me to the next big thing. You want to establish a concept that can evolve. So what I mean by that is, don't be entirely reliant on actual time, for one thing, but also establish a core conflict that can change as different parts of those conflicts get solved. In this case, that's when you really need to start thinking about the franchise itself, like the way they really do in television. So the franchise in TV gets established and reestablished in every episode, essentially, using the opening credits most often. So think about the opening credits of The Sopranos. You guys all remember that? Tony Soprano gets in his car in New York, and he drives from New York across the bridge into Jersey, through all the neighborhoods in Jersey, and then pulls up to the front door of his house. And in that time, there's that great song, "Woke up this morning, got yourself a gun." So that's playing in the background. You see Tony Soprano's looking around at every single thing that is going to be important in his life. And you know he's a bad guy, because the show's called The Sopranos and the logo's a gun. But you begin to know also, like, he is invested not just in himself, he's invested in this city. He's invested in this world, but it all boils down to what's going to happen inside of his house. This inside of his house is the most important thing that happens in every single episode of The Sopranos. Yeah, he's a gangster. Yeah, he's a New York gangster. Yeah, he's a New Jersey gangster. Yeah, he's going to be doing strip club stuff, and he's going to be burying dudes out in the Pine Barrens. But at the end of every episode, he's going to be in that house, and he's going to have to deal with his wife and kids. Likewise, think about the opening of Game of Thrones. Every episode of Game of Thrones opens up with that giant map of the Game of Thrones and the rise and fall of different kingdoms that actually maps the passage of time in the show itself. So there's that part of it, the actual franchise that you are establishing. But when we talk about having the concept of your story evolve, what we're also meaning is, like, be honest with yourself about how you want to continue to write your stories. So if you just want to write about a cop who solves crimes, or a private detective, or whatever, at some point he or she has to be passionate about their job. And if that passion begins to wane, how do you continue to write that story? Or if that person gets shot, like, why would they go back to that job? Or it's the 21st century, why don't they just do stuff online? So you have to be really honest about how to set that up. Now, a great example of this happens in legal thrillers, for instance. So we're going to look at a very quick example of the opening of a legal thriller. One moment, please. And we're going to look at this opening from Scott Turow's Presumed Innocent. So Turow has written, I think, 5 books within this universe that descended from Presumed Innocent. He's written about Rusty Sabich 2 different times. He's written about the other lawyers 2 different times. He's also then just continued writing about that general area. But from Presumed Innocent itself, he's gone back to this main character on a couple different occasions. So this is how the book Presumed Innocent begins. This is how I always start. I'm the prosecutor. I represent the state. I'm here to present to you the evidence of a crime. Together, you will weigh the evidence. You will deliberate upon it. You will decide if it proves the defendant's guilt. This man, and here I point. So what's the important thing here? What's the franchise defining part of this opening? Anyone? Bueller? Anyone?
He's almost condemning the man by pointing at him.
Absolutely. But there's a single word again that's important.
Prosecutor.
Start.
How
You.
about deliberate?
No?
Always how I start.
Always. Who said always?
This is how I always start.
Always, yes. We are in the middle of a life. And what Thoreau has done by saying, this is how I always start, is he's letting you know that there is a before and there is an after to this story. And that allows him the distance to create this character and to create this world. This is how I always start. It's not, this is how I used to start. It's not, this is how I started back then. This is how I always start. But as the first person said, very, very correct. You know, it's the aspersion of guilt immediately, but then the questioning of it that also begins to create the story around it. As these books go, of course, we all remember that summer, right? When everyone read Presumed Innocent. Remember that summer? It's like you were on vacation and everyone had that fucking book on their lap. Drink, Maddie, I said the F word. Everyone read that book, and no one, like, people were pretty good, right, about not telling you the wife did it. Oh my God, the wife did it. Like, that was the secret. It was like when Gone Girl came out, no one like tried to tell you about what Gone Girl was. But Presumed Innocent was also 10 times better than Gone Girl. Just a really slick and well-written book, and I'm a big fan of Thoreau. I think he's great. I think he could do anything. I'd also like him to represent me if I ever kill a guy. And believe me, I've thought about it. So the way that he writes this allows for also a real interpretation about whether or not he believes in the law as much as he believes in the evidence that can destroy a person. So there's all sorts of little subtextual things in here that I think are very cool. But it allows wild interpretation going forward of this character and of this world. Okay, questions? Anyone? We're good? You guys know exactly what I'm talking about? All right. The next big thing, this is huge for me. This is something I really believe in. And it dovetails nicely into my new book, The Low Desert, which is that I'm a huge proponent of setting. Setting. You need to place your stories in a believable world that also changes. Now, what does that mean? It can be a small town, it can be a big town, but that place needs to be affected both by people and by circumstances. So, for instance, have any of you read the Sookie Stackhouse books that became the TV show True Blood? Okay, so some of you have, I can see. So those books primarily take place in Bon Temps. That's my accent. Hope you enjoyed that. But in each book, what happens is a new character comes to town and it upends everything for the duration of the novel, right? And then that person leaves or is killed or is determined to be a demon or Elvis, and things go back to normal. The stories continue. They don't stand alone. The town continues to be there, but the arrival of that person, that stranger that comes to town, changes the dynamics of it for the duration of that book. The opposite is something like a crime novel set in a big city with continuing characters. So Robert Crace's Los Angeles or Spencer's Boston. These are cities that are big enough that no new person needs to come to town to upend the story. Merely something bad has to happen. But in large part, the setting is the creator of the conflict. I come from a point of view that that setting begets character, begets plot. So out of a place comes a person, out of a person comes a story. And I mean this on a large level, a town, but I also mean it on a small level, which is a Starbucks or a Target or wherever. Because when I walk into a place, I am ruled by the politics of that place. My actions and reactions are based on the rules of that particular setting. So, for instance, when I go into Target and someone pisses me off and I'm an assassin, say, I'm probably not going to take out my gun and shoot that person, even though I'm an assassin. However, if I'm an assassin and someone pisses me off in the course of doing my job out in the streets of Bulgaria or whatever, I might then shoot that person. Place rules my response. And that is really an important part of understanding how your characters work in these larger sort of stories. You also have to think about, when dealing with setting, emotional setting and historical setting. Remember, we talked about this before about narrative memory, right? So the Spencer novels are actually a good example of this. I've been thinking a lot about these old books lately. For some reason, I don't know. Maybe it's because I really liked them when I was a kid. Have you guys experienced this? Like in the last year, like you really sort of examine the things that gave you comfort when you were younger. Food, music, books, TV shows, whatever it might be. I've found that late at night I watch, old episodes of the Rockford Files or whatever before I go to sleep. At any rate, when Robert Parker started to write the Spencer novels, Spencer was a Korean War vet. Well, that first book came out in 1972 or something. So it's reasonable that Spencer, as a Korean War vet, would be out there fighting crimes. He would be, Korean War ended in 54? So he might be 40 years old out there fighting crimes. But when Parker was still writing novels about Spencer in 2005, well, as a Korean War vet, Spencer would be 117 years old. So now you either make the choice to freeze time, like Sue Grafton did, or say, fuck it and forget about it. But you have to decide something. And I think at some point the reader has to go along with that at some point. Or you see things like, there's some subtle reinventions that happen in television, for instance. So like in the Michael Connelly, Harry Bosch books, Bosch is a Vietnam vet, right? But in the television show, Bosch is a Gulf War vet. Because it's, they're making the TV show in 2017 or whatever. It doesn't make any sense that he's a Vietnam vet. So these are some big choices you have to make. But you also have to decide, like, all right, this emotional setting that I'm creating, if I leave this stuff behind 15 books in, is there something I can replace it with if I never mention it again? So these are things that it's a champagne problem, I assure you. If you're so successful that you're 60 books in and you realize, oh God, my main character is 119 years old, well, you'll figure out something good to do. But these are natural problems that come up. Which leads me to step 7 in our creating of franchise characters, which is don't be afraid to repeat a little. The reason that people come back to these books is they like to be with that character. They like to hear that joke, or they like to see that peculiarity about your character. They want to spend time with that person that they like. If that person is different every single book in a way that makes them unrecognizable, well, the reader doesn't want to spend time with them. So, for instance, in the Burn Notice books, when I wrote the 5 Burn Notice books, I couldn't not have Michael Weston say the words, when you're a spy, ... and have, something at the end of that sentence. That's what the reader wants. The reader wants that in every single book. The reader wants to know that when you're a spy, what? Just like when you read James Bond or see a James Bond movie, you want him to say the name is Bond, James Bond. It's that thing that gives you comfort as a reader. But you don't want to bore yourself. So think about that. Think about the things that you enjoy about that character and that are repeatable, that don't make you want to kill yourself in the process. And then this sort of dovetails into the last big step here, which is create natural ways out of creative ruts, which is to say, don't be afraid to kill. And don't be afraid to kill off characters that you like. Don't be afraid to hurt your main character in irreparable ways. When you want to write these characters for a really long time, the choice is yours. You are making a decision about narrative that exists to you. You are God. And in the natural course of these dangerous books that we all write, I got news for you. People die. And so you can't be afraid to let the natural course of action take place. I think often of George R.R. Martin in this regard, in Game of Thrones. That dude would kill anybody. He didn't give a shit. But what he does and does so well, and which is something I try to do also, and this goes back to this narrative memory issue that we've talked about, is to make sure that if you kill someone or something bad happens, that person doesn't just dissolve like a red shirt on Star Trek, that person's existence still exists in the memory of the characters that you're still writing about. So there are things that happen in my books when someone dies where I think of it as dropping a pebble in the water, and the ripple from that pebble might not make it to the shore into a book I haven't written yet, but I'm going to make it happen. And that allows me to get out of these ruts in a realistic way, that nevertheless also, I think, provide some of the things we've already talked about, which is emotional cliffhangers, secondary characters that change and expose the main character in different ways, forces you to change the setting a little bit. Because really what we're talking about with all of this stuff and creating this larger franchise is creating durable storytelling devices. And whether or not you choose to use the same character over and over again or the same world, so like Tana French's books, right? The Dublin Murder Squad, you're not using the same character. What you're using is this right here, this thing that Dashiell Hammett created. That's what the Dublin Murder Squad is. It's a different character every single time, but it is this very same ethos. All right, so I'm going to stop sharing so I can see all of you. There's all your pretty faces. So this is just a general sort of notion of how to do these things. The other thing that you could do is you could also just write a cozy, and then no one cares about the dead body over and over again that we talked about before, and you're fine. Nothing to worry about. This person can continue catering events with dead bodies. So questions. I'm happy to take any questions you might have. Who's got one?
I have one.
Go ahead.
I'm not a writer, but what is a cozy?
No,
that's why I'm asking.
I'm about to tell you.
Uh,
It's one of those books where there's people eat crumpets, a cat solves a crime. There's
like Agatha Christie?
Agatha Christie is sort of like less cozy than most cozies. Amateur detectives and in Airbnbs on the Eastern Seaboard.
There's a thing on
Think of Angela Lansbury.
Yeah,
Angela
Murder,
Lansbury.
Okay, and,
Yeah.
Murder, She
okay,
Wrote. Yeah.
Yeah.
Murder, She Wrote.
Yeah,
Okay.
Murder, She Wrote. Yeah.
Yeah.
What about the Duke and Mrs. Scarlet? That's on.
Yes, perfect.
Yeah.
Basically, one of those things where people die and no one seems to be affected by it emotionally.
Okay. Thank you.
And there's very limited bloodshed, like a
Limited
bullet,
bloodshed.
just, there's one little tiny dab of blood when somebody's laying down. There's
Right.
And
So
no
if you
nothing
sex.
off-putting.
If
No
you get
sex either.
if you get shot in the head in a cozy, bullet just stays in your head.
No.
You know, in the
There's no
cozy,
language.
there's no dirty undercurrent either.
Right. It's
Uh,
pleasant
And
murder.
usually a cozy, the protagonist, the person discovers who that other person is within a couple of days, maybe a day, two, who knows? No, Cynthia, you're
There's
shaking
usually
your
a
head.
cat involved. There's almost always a cat involved.
Not always a cat.
There's always a cat involved. A
What
chimpanzee,
about, what about
there's a
10 Little
chimpanzee and
Indians?
a cat in all of them.
Okay.
Other questions? Anything else I can tell you that is not going to offend half the people here?
Well, I
There are now
can't
15
guarantee
fine
that,
books
Todd.
available.
Did I ask a question that offended anybody?
No, my response did.
Oh,
Can I ask, you said the supporting characters should be indelible but interchangeable, I believe you said.
Correct.
What does that
Yes.
mean, interchangeable? You mean,
That you can, they don't need to be in every single book. So you want to have memorable secondary characters that you can kill, basically, or whose issues you can solve and then they disappear and you bring on somebody new. So, you know, I sometimes I think when I read books that it's like watching an episode of Fantasy Island where the plane lands, 5 people get off that have a problem, and then the episode ends, you never see them again. But they're not that indelible. There's just Barbie Benton, you know, and Ricardo Montalban. And so you want to have characters that are fun. So I'll give you an example from my own life. So in my first gangster book, Gangsterland, there's a character, a snitch named Paul Bruno, who ends up becoming a real estate agent in Wisconsin. He gives someone some information on something, and then the mob murders him. The fans of the book really love this character. He's an interesting character. I really loved writing him. It bothered me when I had to kill him. It bothers the narrator when he finds him dead. And so when I wrote The Low Desert, I brought Paul Bruno back for a story that takes place before those books, because he is indelible and he is interchangeable, but his story was not complete. And so I felt like I wanted to write about him again, even though he was dead. And it's really, to be clear, it's about creating round characters, even if that character is not the main character. So every single character that I write about, I try to give them, in the scene that they're in, the notion that they are the hero of their own life in that moment. I think too often when we write secondary characters, we use them as blunt devices. But if you imagine every character that comes into your stories, your books, as existing in their own book, and they just happen to cross through yours for that moment, then all of a sudden when they talk, they have conflict. You know, when they do something, it has purpose. There's logic to the things that they are doing. And this is true for someone who's a cab driver in a story of yours. This is true for someone who's serving coffee. If you're going to have a character speak to your narrator, speak at all, they should have the complexity of what a real life person should have, even in that brief moment. And I know that seems like a lot of weight to give just a minor character, but I think that's what gives books depth, is this notion that all characters are main characters, just not in your book. Does that make sense, Pat? Okay.
Could you talk for a moment about setting as that recurring character in a novel or a mystery? For instance, like in the Robichaux novels, you have New Orleans or Montana. The
Mhm.
Hillerman novels, you have the Four Corners. Could you talk about that for a moment?
Yeah, I think setting is extraordinarily important for the notion that I said earlier, that setting begets character begets plot, but also setting sets the rules for a particular place, right? So if you have a crime novel that takes place in a small town in the Midwest, the cops are going to be different than an LA cop. The victims of the crimes might trust those cops more, or they might not trust those cops as much. You might be in a super religiously conservative part of Utah where you're not going to go against your church because of the setting that you're in. Whereas if you told someone the terrible thing that happened, you'd say, well, call the cops. So I can't. The cop knows the head of the Mormon church there and they'll excommunicate me. All of a sudden, the rules of that setting start to affect the emotional decisions of the characters themselves. So everything is predicated on the politics of that world that they live in. So there's that side of it. The other side is, okay, a person who is coming to a town that they haven't lived in before and doesn't know these things, what happens when they upend the rules of that place? So it's sort of what I tell my students. It's harder to tell them this now because none of them have heard of it. It's the Footloose Dictum. Like, he comes to a town where no one's allowed to dance and he wants to dance. What's going to happen next? And so I use the Footloose Dictum oftentimes in crime fiction. Like, someone is going to come in and he is going to bring order into the chaos of this town because he doesn't care about whoever's in charge. And setting plays a huge role in that because of ingrained thoughts about families and politics, the actual politics, not the sort of politics of place I talked about. All those things play a huge role. And then lastly, you want to think about history, right? So history of crime, history of policing, things of that nature, specifically in crime fiction. When you write a crime novel that takes place in Los Angeles right now, well, are you writing it under the consent decree? Are you writing it pre-Rodney King or after Rodney King? Are you writing it post-George Floyd or before George Floyd? Like, all of these things that are happening, you have to then factor in the larger notion of what Los Angeles policing is, if you're going to write it sort of authentically. Or are you going to write it in 1960s, pre or post Watts? All these things that you have to think about. And if you don't think about those things, then I think your novel really suffers because it could take place anywhere. And you want to have a peculiar notion of place to make your story stand out. In the Low Desert, my new book, the reason I set the stuff in these weird little desert resort towns and quasi-resort towns is that I'm fascinated by what happens in the underbelly of places built on pleasure, basically. Like, there's this idea when you're on vacation, right, that the people working at the hotel are pleased to have you there and they're happy to serve you. Like, those people hate you. They want you to go home. They're happy for your money, but they hate you personally. The people at the hotel where you're staying, they want you to leave. The people at the Airbnb, they want you to leave. All they want is for you to leave. And so I'm always interested in that underbelly that exists. I mean, all of you have been to Vegas, right? If you go to Vegas and then you wake up at, like, say you wake up at 7 and you look out your window at the Strip, it is the most disgusting place you've ever seen in your entire life. Vegas is only nice when the lights are off. And I'm fascinated by that. I'm fascinated by this ability that we have to paint over the things that we don't want to see in order to have a good time in our life. And all of that is a function of setting, particularly in crime fiction. Does that make sense, James? Yeah. Other thoughts, questions, concerns? We now have 9 books left.
Todd, I have one. So
Yes.
when you were talking about the steps for creating the franchise character,
Mhm.
and in your opinion, how have franchise characters changed recently, and what components or what parts of this character need to change to appeal to readers today, or are they the same?
No, they've changed. They've absolutely changed. And part of the change has to do, frankly, with television, with prestige TV, essentially. Like the last 10 years of crime television has changed the way we look at books. You know, we don't want a main character to be unaffected by violence. We don't want someone to kill a bunch of people and feel nothing about it afterward. It doesn't seem real to us, because we are experiencing so much violence in our lives that we can't just pretend that 9/11 didn't happen, right? Like, we all saw people die in those buildings, and that had an indelible response to us. We all saw kids get killed at Columbine, and that left an indelible mark on us. We've all seen, you know, that shooting in Vegas where that guy shot 600 people. We're all left, you know, damaged from that. To have these characters that solve crimes who can just exist book to book and not be any different based on the horrible things that they've seen and done isn't realistic. I mean, you also have to think about it in terms of where we are as a society. Like every detective novel that's not a cop novel, in every private detective novel, is about bad police work. It's about shitty cops. They couldn't solve this crime. I got to go hire somebody because that cop can't do my job. Can't do the job. That has a larger social issue question to it now. Like, why didn't the cop solve that particular thing? So all of these things are changing over the course of the last 10 years, but also in a very compressed period of time, in like last 2 years, you see all of this stuff happening at a very fast rate. And I think of a book like Your House Must Pay by Steph Chaw, which is not a series book, but it's a great crime novel, and it's about a long-standing crime in Los Angeles, and about different social strata in Los Angeles as well. And what that book does, and does extraordinarily well, is it shows all sides of a crime and forces you as the reader to make decisions about it. That comes from television. That comes from The Wire. That comes from watching The Wire for 5 seasons and seeing the cops, the criminals, the media, all that stuff at one time. You used to not get books like that. That comes from television. So I really am seeing a sea change with this sort of stuff. Absolutely. And I need it. Even when I think about the old books, like I brought up Spencer, like I said, it's comforting, like, to go watch old episodes of Spencer for Hire, but it's also like, wow, like he shot like 7 people and no one seems to give a shit. I mean, I actually talked about this to you guys like 5 years ago. But like I had this moment watching a television show and thinking about killing when I was writing Gangster Land, which I was watching some show that my wife and I used to like, where like 2 good-looking guys would go to a foreign country, they'd have sex with beautiful women.
Oh, Strike Back.
Strike Back, yes. And in every
I haven't
episode,
seen that, but no.
they'd kill like 45 people.
Right.
And it just started to bother me. Like, what am I watching? Like, why am I giving this my entertainment approval? Because like every dead guy has a mom, you know, like every single dead guy has a mom. And it just sort of began to bother me, the cartoon notion of death and violence. And so I've tried to do different things in my own life because of that. And you aren't seeing as much of that in TV anymore, or in books, quite frankly.
Which is interesting what you said, because that one of those guys went on to star in Blind Spot.
Yeah.
Right. So, but
Yeah.
in that show, he's all emotionally angsty, twisty, tortured, and if he stepped on a cat, he would,
Right.
look at that cat.
Right.
So you see the difference. That's really interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree.
Anybody else have anything for Todd?
Diane had a question. I remember
Uh,
seeing Diane pop up. There
So
she is.
I was going to comment.
Todd, can you talk about,
Oh, hold on one sec, Pat. Diane was talking.
Okay, go ahead.
Oh, that's okay, thanks. I was just going to comment that I really enjoyed your book, your talk, because it's really helping me with my book, but also that I was playing the drinking game, and you started out really, really slow, and I was afraid I was going to end up dismally sober, but you finally came out with 4 drinking words and 9 instances of other words that I toasted to as well.
Done.
So thank you very much.
Fuck yeah. All right, Pat.
well, when I read Gangster Nation, it was the first organized crime mob novel I'd ever read. I haven't even read The Godfather. So, and I really enjoyed it. And it surprised me that I enjoyed it. And I couldn't figure out why, but I think it's because I know, yeah.
Thanks, Pat.
I think I see Rabbi Cohen as a loner, like the protagonist in The Informer or in Odd Man Out.
Mhm.
Someone who is every time he turns around, he doesn't know if he's going to be turned in,
Right.
and he's just facing, a challenge of survival when he doesn't know who he can trust. Can you talk about that aspect of the novel?
Yeah. Every single scene in Gangsterland and Gangster Nation, I want you to be concerned that Rabbi David Cohen is either going to kill someone or be killed. Every single scene. Every single scene. There is the undercurrent in every scene that he might kill somebody. And that's intentional. I want you to feel uneasy around him. And I want you to feel uneasy with your like of him. Like, why do I like this guy? This is a very strange thing. I should not like him. The reason you do like him is because somebody loves him and because he loves somebody else. And so that's the trick, right? Like that's the line of empathy that I build in that forces you to consider other parts of this person's life. The other thing is that and I was just talking about this with my friend Mark Haskell Smith the other day. He interviewed me for at a bookstore. I like to write about people that are really competent at their jobs and have them come into contact with people who think they're really good at that same job and aren't. And all of us have had that experience, right? Where we're really good at something and someone tries to tell us about what we do. And you always think the same thing in those situations. I'd like to fucking kill that person. Please stop talking. And so I think when I'm writing those scenes and it's the Rabbi David Cohen, Sal Cupertine hitman guy, and he's really good at his job. Turns out he's really good as a rabbi and really good as a hitman. And when other people try to be tough around him, what you want is for him to show you what tough is. And I think there's something enjoyable about that. It's the fantasy we all have, right? Of like, oh, you're gonna find out. Like, fuck around and you'll find out. Drink, Dan, drink. Fuck around and you'll find out. That makes sense?
Yep.
All right. What else can I tell you guys?
Anything else?
Any other big questions? I showered for all of you. I want you to know that.
Are you in your office, Todd?
Yes, this is my office at home. This is where I do all my work.
Nice.
This is where the dreams happen. No.
I've taken so many notes, even though my screen has been turned off because my internet has been blinky. But what a great talk. I can't wait to read your book.
Thank you.
It just sounds so interesting. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. I appreciate
so
it.
much.
And Jim Warren won one. So we'll be sending you a book through Mystery Inc. And
Two corgis.
what?
I have 2 corgis and they're barking, so.
So anyway, yeah, thank you, everybody. If I've noticed that 1 or 2 of you are new here, and if you're not on our mailing list, go to ocsistersincrime.org, and every month we have 1 or 2 events going on. So anyway, thank you, Todd, and thank you, everybody, for
My
being
pleasure.
here.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it. And hey, I have to tell you all before we leave, Barbara has a new book coming out in just a couple months, Palm Springs Noir.
Oh,
And it features a brilliant author,
And you're in it.
and I am in it. You guys should all go buy that book. And we're going to do a big event when we're all free again for that book when it comes out. And we'll do it with Sisters in Crime too, I promise.
great. Great.
Thanks, Todd.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Good to see y'all.